I always knew my family would find new ways to remind me that I was the disappointment at every gathering, but I never imagined my sister Veronica would stand up at her own anniversary dinner and announce to 40 guests that I was the family failure who couldn't even hold down a minimum wage job. While her hedge fund manager husband Marcus smirked from his seat at the head table, completely unaware that in less than 6 hours, federal agents would be seizing all his assets and he'd be facing 20 years in prison for securities fraud. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sometimes the most satisfying moments come served alongside champagne and bitter family truths. What happened that night didn't just change that anniversary celebration. It completely obliterated every assumption my family had made about success, failure, and who really deserved their precious respect. Before we dive back into this incredible story, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this tale of ultimate vindication speaks to you, make sure you hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story is going to leave you absolutely speechless. The Blackstone Country Club in Millfield Heights had been the setting for every major Carmichael family celebration for the past 15 years. Tonight marked Veronica and Marcus Wellington's 5th wedding anniversary, and no expense had been spared to remind everyone in attendance exactly where they stood in the social hierarchy of our small but affluent Connecticut town. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across tables adorned with imported flowers that probably cost more than I made in a month at my job as a night shift security guard at the local community college. The guest list read like a who's who of regional wealth: hedge fund managers, real estate developers, corporate lawyers, and country club board members, all gathered to celebrate what my family considered their crown jewel, my sister's marriage, to Marcus Wellington III, heir to a financial empire, and the golden boy who had supposedly elevated our entire family's social status. I sat at table 12, strategically positioned in the back corner where my presence could be acknowledged without drawing too much attention to what my mother, Patricia Carmichael, diplomatically referred to as Sophia's ongoing situation. The situation being that at 28, I was still working blue-collar jobs, living in a studio apartment above Mrs. Chen's flower shop downtown, and showing no signs of achieving the kind of success that would make me worthy of prime seating at family events. My black dress was 3 years old, purchased for a job interview that hadn't gone well, and carefully maintained to serve for occasions like this where appearance mattered more than comfort. Around me, women wore designer gowns that cost more than my annual rent, discussing vacation homes in the Hamptons and charity galas in Manhattan, their conversations punctuated by the gentle clinking of Waterford crystal and nervous laughter. No. Irony wasn't lost on me that I was probably the only person in the room who actually worked for a living, but in the Carmichael family social mathematics, honest work was worth less than inherited wealth or lucrative marriages. Success was measured by zip codes, car brands, and the ability to contribute meaningfully to conversations about investment portfolios and private school admissions. Veronica held court at the head table like a queen surveying her kingdom, her Vera Wang gown shimmering under the chandelier light as she accepted congratulations and well wishes from an endless stream of admirers. At 31, she had achieved everything our parents had dreamed of: a wealthy husband, a mansion in the most exclusive neighborhood, and the kind of social connections that opened doors throughout New England's upper echelons. Marcus sat beside her, commanding attention with the easy confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. His family's investment firm, Wellington Capital Management, controlled millions in assets and had been featured on the covers of financial magazines as an example of next-generation wealth management. He was the son-in-law my parents had always hoped for. Educated at Harvard Business School, connected to old money families, and sophisticated enough to elevate the Carmichael name in social circles they had always aspired to join. My father, Dr. Richard Carmichael, a successful orthopedic surgeon, beamed with pride as he watched his elder daughter navigate the evening's social dynamics with practiced ease. He had spent decades building his medical practice and accumulating the kind of respectability that earned invitations to country club events, but Veronica's marriage had catapulted the family into true elite status. The contrast between my sisters' triumph and my apparent failure had been a recurring theme at family gatherings for years. Every holiday dinner included subtle comparisons between Veronica's accomplishments and my perceived shortcomings. Every birthday celebration somehow became an opportunity to discuss why I hadn't followed my sister's example of strategic marriage and social advancement. "Sophia has always been our free spirit," my mother would explain to concerned relatives, the phrase free spirit serving as diplomatic code for disappointment. "She's still finding her path," she would add, as if my career in security work was a temporary detour rather than honest employment that I actually found meaningful. Tonight felt different, though. The weight of accumulated disappointment seemed heavier, the whispered conversations about my life choices more pointed. I had overheard my Aunt Dorothy telling someone that it was such a shame about Richard's younger daughter, and tragic when one child succeeds so brilliantly while the other just drifts. What none of them knew, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that in just a few hours, everything they thought they understood about success and failure would be turned completely upside down. The man they all admired, the golden boy who had supposedly saved our family's social standing, was about to become the center of the biggest financial scandal our town had ever witnessed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to how this evening of ultimate vindication really began, and how the family disappointment ended up being the only one left standing when the dust finally settled. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My journey to becoming the family disappointment hadn't happened overnight. It was a carefully constructed narrative that my family had been building since I graduated from Millfield Community College with an associate degree in criminal justice instead of following Veronica to Yale like everyone expected. Growing up as the younger Carmichael daughter meant living in a shadow that seemed to grow longer with each of my sister's achievements. While Veronica was earning perfect grades, winning debate tournaments, and collecting college scholarships, I was the kid who preferred working part-time at the local animal shelter to studying for standardized tests that would determine my potential for success. The differences between us weren't just academic. Veronica had inherited our mother's sharp cheekbones and our father's commanding presence, moving through social situations with the natural grace of someone born to lead conversation and influence outcomes. She understood instinctively how to dress for success, which topics to discuss at dinner parties, and how to network her way into opportunities that others could only dream about. I, on the other hand, had always been more comfortable with authenticity than performance. While Veronica was mastering the art of strategic conversation, I was volunteering at homeless shelters and tutoring kids who couldn't afford private academic support. While she was cultivating relationships with influential classmates, I was forming friendships with people based on genuine connection rather than social advancement potential. My parents had tried to shape me into a more socially advantageous direction throughout high school and college. "Sophia, darling," my mother would say during her carefully orchestrated guidance sessions, "you have so much potential, but you need to think more strategically about your future. Look at how Veronica approaches her goals. She understands that success requires planning and social awareness." The implication was always clear. My choices reflected poor judgment rather than different values. My decision to study criminal justice was seen as settling for a lesser career path. My preference for honest work over prestigious internships was interpreted as lack of ambition. My relationships with working-class friends were viewed as social limitations rather than meaningful connections. After graduation, I had briefly attempted to meet their expectations by applying for positions at law firms and corporate security, companies that would have impressed the country club crowd. But The interview process felt like performing in a play where I didn't understand my character's motivation. I was trying to become someone I wasn't in order to earn approval from people who fundamentally didn't respect who I actually was. The turning point came when I was offered a position as head of security at Millfield Community College, the same institution where I had earned my degree. The job paid a decent salary, came with excellent benefits, and involved meaningful work, protecting students and faculty in an educational environment I genuinely cared about. Most importantly, it felt authentic to my values and interests in a way that corporate positions never had. My family's reaction to my career choice was swift and devastating. "Security guard?" my father had repeated during the dinner where I announced my decision, his voice carrying the same tone he might use to discuss a terminal diagnosis. "Sophia, this is exactly what we've been trying to help you avoid. You're limiting yourself to a working-class existence when you could be building a professional career." Veronica had been more diplomatic but equally dismissive. "I'm sure it's a nice temporary position while you figure out your real direction," she had said, her smile carrying the practiced warmth she used with charity cases. "Maybe after a year or two, you'll be ready to consider more ambitious options." The temporary position had turned into 3 years of work that I found genuinely fulfilling. I had implemented new safety protocols that reduced campus incidents by 40%. I had developed relationships with students who trusted me enough to report concerning situations before they escalated into serious problems. I had earned the respect of faculty and administrators who valued my dedication and professional competence. But none of these achievements translated into family respect. At every gathering, my job was referenced with the kind of apologetic tone people use when discussing unfortunate medical conditions. "Sophia is working in security right now," my mother would explain to curious relatives, the phrase "right now" suggesting that my career was a temporary phase I would eventually outgrow. The contrast with Veronica's trajectory couldn't have been more stark. After Yale, she had moved to Manhattan to work for a prestigious marketing firm, where she had quickly climbed the ladder through a combination of genuine talent and strategic relationship building. Her engagement to Marcus had been celebrated as the culmination of perfect planning, a beautiful, intelligent woman securing her future with a wealthy, connected man from an established family. Their wedding had been featured in the society pages of 3 regional magazines. Their home in Millfield Heights' most exclusive neighborhood was regularly mentioned in local lifestyle publications. Their social calendar included charity galas, golf tournaments, and private parties with some of the most influential people in Connecticut's financial and political circles. My studio apartment above Mrs. Chen's flower shop didn't rate magazine coverage, but it was mine. I had furnished it with pieces I had carefully selected and saved for, creating a space that reflected my personality rather than social expectations. The neighborhood was diverse and vibrant, full of small business owners, artists, and working families who understood the value of honest labor and authentic community. Mrs. Chen, my 70-year-old landlord, had become an unexpected mentor and friend. She had emigrated from Taiwan 30 years ago with nothing but determination and had built her flower shop into a thriving business through sheer hard work and genuine care for her customers. Her perspective on success was refreshingly different from my family's obsession with status and social climbing. "Success," she had told me one evening as we shared tea in her shop, "is not about impressing people who don't know your heart. Success is about sleeping peacefully because you lived honestly and helped others when you could." Her wisdom resonated in ways that my parents' ambitious planning never had. But tonight, surrounded by crystal and designer gowns at Veronica's anniversary celebration, Mrs. Chen's philosophy felt naive and insufficient. Tonight, the weight of being the family disappointment seemed heavier than ever, and I wondered if choosing authenticity over advancement had been the biggest mistake of my life. I had no idea that within hours I would discover just how wrong that assumption really was. The Blackstone Country Club represented everything the Carmichael family had aspired to for generations. Established in 1924 by railroad barons and shipping magnates, it had evolved into the epicenter of Millfield Heights. Social and business elite. Membership wasn't just about wealth, it was about pedigree, connections, and the kind of understated power that shaped municipal decisions over 18 holes of golf and 3 martini lunches. The club's mahogany-paneled walls displayed oil, portraits of founding members whose descendants still controlled the town's major banks, law firms, and development companies. These weren't new money families who had earned their fortunes through innovation or hard work. These were bloodlines that stretched back to colonial land grants and industrial monopolies. Families whose wealth had been carefully preserved and strategically multiplied across centuries of careful marriage alliances and conservative investments. Marcus Wellington's family occupied the pinnacle of this carefully constructed hierarchy. His great-grandfather had founded Wellington Capital Management in 1952, transforming a modest inheritance into a regional investment powerhouse that now managed over $2 billion in assets. The firm's client roster read like a directory of New England's most established families, many of whom had been entrusting their financial futures to Wellington expertise for 3 generations. The current Wellington empire extended far beyond investment management. They owned commercial real estate throughout Connecticut and Massachusetts, maintained controlling interests in 3 regional banks, and had recently expanded into private equity ventures that were reshaping entire industries. Marcus himself had been groomed from childhood to inherit not just the family business, but the social and political influence that came with it. At Harvard Business School, he had been recruited by professors who understood his family's significance in the regional power structure. His thesis on emerging market strategies had been published in prestigious financial journals, not just because of its academic merit, but because having the Wellington name associated with cutting-edge thinking enhanced the university's relationships with potential donors. His graduation had been attended by senators, federal judges, and Fortune 500 CEOs who recognized him as a future leader in their exclusive circles. The other families represented at tonight's anniversary celebration occupied various levels within this established hierarchy. The Ashfords controlled municipal construction contracts through their relationships with city planning commissioners. The Blackwood family owned the luxury car dealerships where status-conscious residents purchased their BMWs and Mercedes. The Thorntons ran the private bank that financed most of the town's major real estate developments. Each family understood their role in maintaining the delicate ecosystem of influence and reciprocal benefit that kept their world functioning smoothly. Social events like tonight's celebration weren't just parties, they were business meetings disguised as entertainment, opportunities to negotiate deals, arrange favors, and ensure that power remained concentrated among the right people. Dr. Richard Carmichael had spent decades working to earn his place within this structure. As a surgeon, he possessed professional expertise that was valuable to the community, but his middle-class origins meant he had to prove his worthiness through consistent demonstration of proper values and social awareness. Every charitable donation, every country club committee membership, every carefully chosen political endorsement had been calculated to advance his family's social standing. Veronica's marriage to Marcus represented the culmination of his strategic planning. Through her connection to the Wellington family, the Carmichaels had gained access to social circles that had previously been closed to them. Business opportunities that had once been distributed among established families now included my father's practice in their considerations. Invitations to exclusive events arrived regularly, acknowledging their new status as legitimate members of the inner circle. The unspoken rules governing this world were complex and unforgiving. Success was measured not just by wealth, but by the ability to deploy that wealth in ways that enhanced one's social position. Charitable giving was expected, but it had to be directed toward causes that were approved by the community leadership. Business partnerships were evaluated based on their potential for advancing mutual interests rather than purely financial considerations. Personal relationships were similarly strategic. Marriages weren't just unions between individuals. They were alliances between families that could reshape the balance of local power. Children were educated at specific schools not just for academic excellence, but for the connections they would form with future leaders. Even friendships were evaluated based on their potential for advancing family interests and maintaining appropriate social boundaries. The country club's staff moved through the anniversary celebration with the invisible efficiency of people who understood their place in this hierarchy. Servers wore crisp white uniforms and maintained deferential silence while refilling crystal glasses and adjusting floral arrangements. Their presence was essential but unacknowledged, much like the broader working-class population that enabled the elite lifestyle without being permitted to participate in its benefits. Most of the club's employees lived in modest neighborhoods on the other side of town, commuting daily to serve people whose annual clothing budgets exceeded their yearly salaries. They understood intuitively that their job security depended on maintaining appropriate boundaries and never presuming equality with the members they served. The invisible barriers between social classes were reinforced through countless daily interactions that reminded everyone of their assigned roles. The entertainment for the evening reflected the sophisticated tastes expected at such gatherings. A string quartet played classical selections that demonstrated cultural refinement without being so ambitious as to interfere with conversation. The menu featured delicacies that were expensive rather than filling, designed more for their symbolic value than their nutritional content. Everything had been carefully curated to signal prosperity, taste, and social awareness. Conversations flowed seamlessly between topics that required insider knowledge to navigate successfully. Discussions of recent vacation destinations assumed familiarity with European hotels and Caribbean resorts that cost more per night than most people earned in weeks. References to children's academic achievements presupposed understanding of prestigious boarding schools and Ivy League admission strategies. Investment advice was exchanged casually, involving sums that represented life-changing amounts to anyone outside their circle. The women's attire served as a complex system of social communication, with designer labels, jewelry selections, and styling choices all conveying specific messages about family status and personal sophistication. Each outfit represented careful planning and substantial investment, chosen not just for aesthetic appeal but for its ability to communicate the wearer's understanding of appropriate luxury consumption. Political discussions were conducted with the assumption that personal interests aligned naturally with broader social good. Tax policies were evaluated based on their impact on investment portfolios rather than their effects on working families. Municipal development plans were assessed for their potential to enhance property values in desirable neighborhoods. Social programs were discussed as necessary expenses rather than moral imperatives. This was the world that had embraced Veronica and rejected me, not because of our individual merits, but because of our willingness to participate in its complex systems of mutual validation and exclusion. Tonight, surrounded by the symbols of their collective success, they had no idea that their carefully constructed hierarchy was about to collapse in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Marcus Wellington, the golden boy who represented everything they aspired to become, was about to discover that even the most prestigious family names couldn't protect against the consequences of criminal arrogance and systematic fraud. The pattern of my exclusion from family respect had been so gradual and systematic that I almost didn't recognize it as deliberate until it had become the defining characteristic of every family interaction. It started with small comments that seemed innocuous in isolation, but created a cumulative narrative about my place in the Carmichael hierarchy. Christmas dinners became annual reviews of my progress toward more acceptable life choices. While Veronica's achievements were celebrated with detailed discussions of her latest promotion or Marcus's newest business venture, my job performance was addressed with the kind of concerned sympathy usually reserved for discussing chronic illnesses. "Sophia is still working her security position," my mother would announce to visiting relatives, the word "still" carrying enough disappointment to make everyone uncomfortable. Last Christmas had been particularly brutal. Marcus had just closed a major deal that earned his firm $20 million in fees, and the conversation naturally centered on his financial acumen and strategic thinking. When Uncle Robert asked about my work, the table fell into the kind of polite silence that preceded difficult topics. "Well," my father had said, clearing his throat diplomatically, "Sophia has been very dedicated to her current role. She's learned a lot about institutional security." The pause before institutional security spoke volumes about how my family viewed my career. They couldn't bring themselves to say security guard in front of Marcus, whose casual discussion of hedge fund strategies made my job sound like charity work for the unemployable. The conversation quickly shifted to safer topics, leaving me to finish my dinner while listening to detailed analysis of international investment opportunities that involved more money than I would see in multiple lifetimes. Easter gatherings followed similar scripts. Veronica would arrive in designer outfits that cost more than my monthly salary, carrying gifts that demonstrated both her prosperity and her thoughtfulness. Her contributions to family discussions were valued and encouraged, her opinions sought. On everything from home decoration to political developments, she had become the family spokesperson for success, the daughter whose judgment could be trusted on important matters. My presence at these gatherings was tolerated rather than welcomed. I was included in group photographs, but positioned at the edges where my more modest appearance wouldn't detract from the overall impression of family prosperity. Conversations would pause when I entered rooms, not from genuine interest in my participation, but from polite obligation to acknowledge my presence before returning to more engaging topics. The most painful incidents were the small moments of exclusion that revealed how thoroughly I had been relegated to outsider status within my own family. When Veronica announced her engagement, I learned about it through a group text message rather than a personal phone call. When they purchased their mansion in Millfield Heights, I discovered the news during a casual conversation at a family barbecue, overhearing Marcus describe their home renovation plans to my father. Birthday celebrations became exercises in diplomatic gift-giving that highlighted our different circumstances without directly acknowledging the disparity. Veronica would present my parents with expensive wine collections or artwork that complemented their home's sophisticated aesthetic. Her gifts were always perfectly chosen, demonstrating both her refined taste and her financial capability to express affection through meaningful purchases. My gifts were practical and modest: books, household items, or gift certificates that were appreciated but clearly not in the same category as Veronica's generous presentations. The thank you responses were warm but brief, lacking the enthusiastic gratitude that Veronica's contributions received. I began to suspect that my parents felt somewhat embarrassed by the contrast, as if my inability to give expensive gifts reflected poorly on their parenting or my character development. Professional discussions became particularly uncomfortable as Marcus's career achievements grew more impressive, and my own accomplishments seemed increasingly irrelevant to family conversations. When he was featured in Connecticut Business Magazine as one of the state's rising financial leaders under 35, the article was framed and displayed prominently in my parents' living room. His photograph, looking confident and sophisticated in his corner office, became a constant reminder of what success looked like in the Carmichael family worldview. My own professional achievements, implementing new safety protocols that reduced campus incidents, earning commendations from the college administration, or completing additional training certifications, were acknowledged with polite congratulations that felt perfunctory rather than genuine. The disconnect between their enthusiasm for Marcus's financial success and their tepid response to my actual job performance made it clear that they valued the appearance of success over its substance. Social events became increasingly awkward, as my family struggled to integrate my presence with their growing connections to Millfield Heights elite circles. At country club gatherings, I was introduced with explanations that seemed designed to minimize expectations rather than highlight my capabilities. "This is our younger daughter, Sophia. She's still figuring out her career path," became my mother's standard introduction, delivered with the kind of apologetic smile that suggested I was a temporary embarrassment they hoped to resolve eventually. The contrast with Veronica's introductions was stark and painful. "This is our daughter, Veronica Wellington. She's married to Marcus Wellington from Wellington Capital Management. They're both so accomplished in their respective fields." Her introductions came with obvious pride and anticipation of positive reactions from people who recognized the social significance of her marriage and career achievements. These patterns intensified after Marcus began gaining prominence in regional business circles. Suddenly, my family had access to social opportunities they had only dreamed about previously. Invitations to exclusive charity galas, membership in prestigious committees, and inclusion in high-level business discussions all came through their connection to the Wellington family name. My inability to contribute to these elevated social circumstances made my presence feel increasingly burdensome to family dynamics. I couldn't offer connections to influential people, business opportunities for my father's practice, or social advancement for my parents' community standing. I was, quite literally, the family member who had nothing valuable to contribute to their upward mobility. The most devastating pattern was my family's growing reluctance to discuss me with their new social connections. I discovered this during Veronica's housewarming party, when I overheard my mother explaining to a prominent banker's wife that they had one daughter who was doing very well, without mentioning my existence at all. The casual erasure of my identity felt like a physical blow, confirming that my family found my life choices so embarrassing they preferred to pretend I didn't exist, rather than attempt explanations. Family dinners became performances where I played the role of the cautionary tale, the daughter whose choices served as examples of what could go wrong when young people failed to embrace appropriate ambitions. Marcus would offer sympathetic advice about career development and networking strategies, his tone suggesting that my problems stemmed from lack of guidance rather than different priorities. "The security field has some interesting opportunities," he would say with practiced encouragement, "especially in corporate settings where the compensation and advancement potential are more substantial." His suggestions always involved transforming my work into something more acceptable to their social circle, rather than acknowledging that I might find value in my current position. Tonight's anniversary celebration represented the culmination of years of this systematic exclusion and disappointment. Surrounded by the symbols of their achieved social status, my family's embarrassment about my life choices felt more acute than ever. I was the discordant note in their otherwise harmonious success story, the daughter who had failed to understand that personal fulfillment mattered less than social advancement. What none of them realized was that their carefully constructed world of privilege and status was about to crumble in ways that would make my modest security job look like the most stable foundation any of us possessed. The most painful aspect of my family's systematic dismissal wasn't their obvious disappointment. It was watching the people who should have defended me choose silence instead. My father, Dr. Richard Carmichael, had once been my closest ally, the parent who understood my independent spirit and encouraged my unconventional choices. But as Marcus's influence in our family grew stronger, Dad's support for my decisions became increasingly tentative and conditional. I remembered the conversation we'd had 3 years ago when I first announced my intention to take the security position at Millfield Community College. Dad had listened thoughtfully as I explained why the job appealed to me: the opportunity to protect an educational environment, the chance to work with diverse populations, and the satisfaction of honest labor that served a meaningful purpose. "I think it sounds like important work, sweetheart," he had said, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty that I chose to ignore at the time. That uncertainty had grown into something approaching embarrassment as Marcus became more prominent in our family dynamics. During recent gatherings, I noticed Dad's body language change whenever conversations turned to career topics. He would shift uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding eye contact, as if my professional choices reflected some failure in his parenting that he couldn't quite understand or address. The transformation was most evident during medical conferences, and professional events where Dad's colleagues would ask about his daughters. I learned about his responses secondhand through family friends who mentioned how proudly he spoke about Veronica's marketing career and her marriage to that brilliant young man from Wellington capital. When pressed about me, Dad's enthusiasm would notably diminish. "Sophia is working in institutional security," he would say, using the same euphemistic language that avoided the reality of my blue-collar employment. His reluctance to defend my choices became particularly painful during family discussions where Marcus would offer unsolicited career advice. Rather than supporting my satisfaction with my current position, Dad would nod thoughtfully as Marcus explained the limitations of security work and suggested more ambitious alternatives. "Marcus makes some good points about advancement opportunities," Dad would say afterward, as if my brother-in-law's opinions about my career carried more weight than my own professional experience and personal satisfaction. The incident that crystallized Dad's betrayal had occurred 6 months ago during a dinner celebrating his promotion to Chief of Orthopedic Surgery at Millfield General Hospital. The occasion should have been about his achievement, but somehow the conversation had shifted to discussing each family member's contributions to our collective success. Veronica had spoken eloquently about her recent campaigns for luxury brands, while Marcus had described his firm's expansion into international markets. When attention turned to me, I had mentioned my pride in recently completing advanced crisis management training and implementing new emergency protocols that had been adopted by other institutions in our region. The accomplishments were genuine and significant within my field, representing months of additional study and professional development that had earned recognition from state security organizations. Dad's response had been devastating in its lack of enthusiasm. "That's nice, honey," he had said with the same tone he might use to acknowledge a child's finger painting. Then, turning to Marcus, he had added, "Maybe you could give Sophia some advice about transitioning those skills into more lucrative applications in corporate security." The suggestion that my achievements were merely stepping stones toward something more acceptable, rather than valuable accomplishments in their own right, had felt like a physical blow. Dad wasn't just failing to defend me. He was actively participating in the narrative that my professional choices were inadequate and required correction from someone with superior judgment about career success. My mother's failure as an ally was more predictable but equally devastating. Patricia Carmichael had spent her entire adult life calibrating her behavior to maximize social acceptance and status advancement. Her response to my unconventional choices had always been filtered through concerns about their impact on family reputation, rather than consideration for my personal happiness or professional satisfaction. Mom's attempts to help me had become increasingly invasive and humiliating as our family's social standing improved through Veronica's marriage. She would forward job listings for corporate positions that paid better than my current salary, always accompanied by encouraging notes about expanding my horizons and reaching my full potential. Her suggestions invariably involved abandoning work I found meaningful for careers that would be more impressive to discuss at country club gatherings. The most painful example of her misplaced priorities had occurred during last spring's charity luncheon at the Blackstone Country Club. I had attended as Mom's guest, hoping to support her involvement in organizing fundraising activities for the Children's Hospital. During cocktail hour, she had introduced me to several prominent women with obvious anxiety about their potential reactions to my career. When Mrs. Ashford, the wife of a major construction company owner, had asked about my work, Mom had immediately launched into damage control. Sophia is currently working in educational security, but she's exploring opportunities in corporate consulting, she had said, completely fabricating career ambitions I had never expressed. Her fabrication was designed to make my current position sound temporary while suggesting I possessed the ambition these women would find acceptable. The lie had been embarrassing enough, but Mom's follow-up conversation with me afterward had been devastating. "Darling, I know you're happy with your current job, but you have to understand how it reflects on the family," she had explained with the patient tone she used for explaining obvious truths to slow learners. When people hear security guard, they make assumptions about education and ambition that aren't fair to you, but that's the reality of social perception. Her solution wasn't to challenge other people's prejudices about honest work. It was to pressure me to conform to their expectations. She wanted me to abandon a career I found fulfilling because it didn't match the image she wanted to project about our family's social status and professional achievements. Even Veronica, who might have been expected to show sisterly loyalty, had gradually shifted from supportive encouragement to patronizing advice about my need for greater ambition. Our private conversations had become exercises in diplomatic concern about my limited career prospects and social opportunities. She spoke about my choices with the kind of benevolent worry that suggested she considered me incapable of understanding what was in my own best interests. "I just worry that you're not positioning yourself for long-term success," she had said during our last one-on-one lunch meeting 3 months ago. "Security work is fine for now, but what happens when you want to buy a house or start a family? You'll need more financial stability than your current salary can provide." Her concerns weren't entirely unreasonable from a practical standpoint, but they completely ignored my own assessment of what constituted adequate financial security and meaningful work. More importantly, they reflected the same underlying assumption that had infected my entire family's perspective, that my judgment about my own life was inherently flawed and required correction from people with superior understanding of success and happiness. The allies who should have defended my right to choose my own path had instead become participants in a campaign to convince me that my choices were mistakes, requiring immediate correction. Their failure to support me wasn't motivated by malice, but by their investment in maintaining social relationships that required my transformation into someone more acceptable to their elevated social circle. Tonight, surrounded by the symbols of their achieved status and watching them bask in the reflected glory of Marcus's success, I felt more isolated from my own family than ever before. The people who had raised me to value independence and authenticity had abandoned those principles when maintaining them became socially inconvenient. What none of them realized was that their golden boy, the man whose success had convinced them to abandon their support for my choices, was about to demonstrate that their priorities had been catastrophically misplaced from the very beginning. The invitation to Veronica and Marcus's 5th anniversary celebration had arrived 6 weeks before the event, delivered to my studio apartment, in an envelope so elegant it seemed almost mocking given my modest circumstances. The cream-colored cardstock bore the distinctive watermark of Crane & Co., the same luxury stationery company that had produced their wedding invitations 5 years earlier. Even the method of invitation delivery reinforced the gap between my world and theirs. While other family members and close friends received hand-delivered invitations during personal visits, mine had been mailed with the impersonal efficiency reserved for distant relatives and obligatory guests. The formal wording left no doubt about the event's significance. "Mr. and Mrs. Marcus Wellington III request the pleasure of your company at an evening celebrating 5 years of marriage, to be held at the Blackstone Country Club on Saturday, the 15th of October, at 7 o'clock in the evening. Black tie requested." The phrase "black tie requested" might as well have been written in a foreign language, given my complete lack of appropriate formal wear and limited budget for acquiring it. My first instinct had been to decline the invitation with some diplomatic excuse about work obligations or prior commitments. The thought of spending an entire evening surrounded by people who viewed my existence as a family embarrassment felt emotionally exhausting before it even began. I could already anticipate the careful conversations designed to avoid discussing my career, the polite smiles that didn't reach anyone's eyes, and the general atmosphere of tolerance rather than welcome that characterized my inclusion in family events. But declining wasn't really an option. Mom had called within hours of my invitation's delivery to discuss the importance of family solidarity during significant celebrations. "This is a milestone anniversary for Veronica and Marcus," she had explained with the patient tone she used when delivering obvious information to someone she considered slow to understand. Your absence would be noticed and commented upon by their friends and business associates. We need to present a united family front during important social occasions. The subtext was clear. My attendance wasn't desired for its own sake, but required to maintain the appearance of family harmony that supported Veronica and Marcus's social standing. I was expected to serve as a prop in their performance of successful family life, contributing my presence while minimizing any disruption to their carefully crafted image of prosperity and achievement. Shopping for appropriate attire became an exercise in financial creativity that highlighted the vast economic gulf between my circumstances and the expected standards of the evening. The department stores in Millfield Heights carried formal wear that cost more than my monthly rent, while the discount retailers offered dresses that would immediately signal my economic limitations to everyone present. I finally found a compromise at a consignment shop 2 towns over. A black cocktail dress that had been expensive when originally purchased, but was now within my budget due to being several seasons out of fashion. The dress fit reasonably well and looked appropriate from a distance, but close inspection revealed the subtle signs of previous wear and careful maintenance that would distinguish it from the designer originals other guests would be wearing. I spent an hour researching proper accessories and makeup techniques online, trying to bridge the gap between my natural appearance and the polished sophistication expected at country club events. Even preparing for the evening became a reminder of my outsider status within my own family. While Veronica had hired professional stylists for hair and makeup, I was attempting to recreate similar results using drugstore cosmetics and YouTube tutorials in my small bathroom mirror. The contrast between our preparation methods felt symbolic of our different relationships to the world we would both be inhabiting that evening. The week leading up to the anniversary celebration had been filled with increasingly anxious anticipation, as I considered the various ways the evening could become uncomfortable or humiliating. Family events had become predictable in their patterns of exclusion and condescension, but formal gatherings with extended social networks introduced additional variables that could amplify any awkwardness surrounding my presence. Marcus's business associates would be attending, many of whom had never met me but had certainly heard family discussions about Veronica's accomplished sister and her successful marriage. Their expectations would be calibrated to assume I possessed similar achievements and social sophistication, making my actual circumstances particularly jarring when revealed through casual conversation. I had rehearsed responses to anticipated questions about my career, attempting to find language that acknowledged my work honestly while minimizing the social discomfort it might cause other guests. The challenge was describing my job in terms that wouldn't immediately signal working-class status, while avoiding outright deception about my responsibilities and professional circumstances. The decision about transportation to the event had required careful consideration of both practical and symbolic factors. Taking public transportation would have been economically sensible, but would have meant arriving at the country club via methods that other guests would find noteworthy for their obvious economy. Driving my 10-year-old Honda would place my modest vehicle among the BMWs, Mercedes, and luxury SUVs that typically filled the club's parking area, creating another visible reminder of my different economic circumstances. I had ultimately decided to drive myself, reasoning that the independence of having my own transportation would be worth the mild embarrassment of my car's appearance among the more expensive vehicles. The decision also preserved my ability to leave early if the evening became too uncomfortable, avoiding the need to depend on family members for rides that might require enduring additional criticism or advice during the journey home. The morning of the anniversary celebration arrived with crisp October weather that seemed designed to showcase the Connecticut countryside at its most beautiful. Driving through Millfield Heights on my way to work, I passed the elaborate preparations visible at houses hosting pre-event gatherings and noticed the increased activity at local businesses catering to the evening's festivities. The entire affluent community seemed to be preparing for what was clearly considered a significant social occasion. My own preparation had been much simpler: a regular 8-hour shift at the college, followed by careful attention to grooming and dressing in my small apartment. The contrast between my practical daily routine and the elaborate preparations others were making for the same event emphasized the different worlds we inhabited, even when attending identical functions. Standing in front of my bathroom mirror, that afternoon, adjusting the second-hand dress and hoping the careful makeup application would be sufficient to meet the evening's standards, I felt the familiar mixture of resignation and determination that characterized my approach to family obligations. I knew the evening would be difficult, but I also knew that my absence would create more problems than my presence, regardless of how uncomfortable that presence might become. The drive to the Blackstone Country Club took 30 minutes through increasingly exclusive neighborhoods where the houses grew larger and the gates more elaborate with each mile. By the time I reached the club's entrance, my anxiety had crystallized into the focused calm I used during challenging situations at work, a professional detachment that allowed me to function effectively while protecting my emotional core from immediate harm. What I couldn't have anticipated was that this evening, which I had expected to be merely another exercise in family tolerance and social discomfort, would become the night when years of accumulated resentment and hidden truths would explode into public view with consequences that none of us could have imagined. The Blackstone Country Club's main ballroom had been transformed into a vision of understated elegance that showcased exactly the kind of sophisticated taste the Wellington family was known for. Crystal chandeliers cast warm golden light across round tables draped in ivory linen, each centerpiece featuring white orchids flown in from Hawaii specifically for the occasion. The attention to detail was extraordinary, from the hand-calligraphed place cards to the vintage champagne being served during cocktail hour. Everything had been designed to demonstrate not just wealth, but impeccable taste in its deployment. I arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, having timed my entrance to avoid being either embarrassingly early or noticeably late. The valet parking attendants moved with practiced efficiency, though I noticed the slight pause when my Honda appeared among the evening's more typical luxury vehicles. The young man who took my keys maintained perfect professional composure, but his momentary hesitation spoke volumes about how rarely the club's staff encountered economy cars during formal events. Walking through the club's mahogany-paneled entrance hall, I was immediately struck by the sheer number of guests who had gathered to celebrate Veronica and Marcus's anniversary. The invitation had mentioned 40 guests, but the assembled crowd seemed larger and more impressive than I had anticipated. These weren't just family friends and business associates. These were people whose names appeared regularly in the society pages and business journals, regional power brokers who had traveled significant distances to honor the Wellington family connection. Marcus stood near the bar area, commanding attention with the natural ease of someone who had never questioned his right to occupy center stage. He wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than my annual clothing budget, his Harvard class ring catching the chandelier light as he gestured during animated conversation with a group of men I recognized from financial news programs. His laugh carried the confident resonance of someone discussing subjects he had mastered completely, and the deferential attention of his audience made it clear they considered his opinions valuable and worth remembering. Veronica moved through the crowd with the graceful confidence of a woman who understood her role as the evening's co-hostess perfectly. Her gown was a masterpiece of understated luxury, midnight blue silk that had clearly been custom designed to complement her figure and coloring. The jewelry she wore was family heirloom quality, pieces that had probably been passed down through generations of Wellington women and were worth more than most people's annual salaries. She accepted congratulations and well wishes with practiced warmth, her smile never wavering as she navigated conversations with business leaders, political figures, and social luminaries. My parents had positioned themselves strategically near the entrance to greet guests as they arrived, clearly relishing their role as family representatives in this elevated social gathering. Dad wore his best tuxedo, the one he reserved for medical society galas and other prestigious events, though even his finest formal wear looked modest compared to the bespoke tailoring evident on most of the other men present. Mom had chosen a conservative black cocktail dress accessorized with pearls, appropriate but not distinctive, expensive enough to avoid embarrassment, but not so luxurious as to suggest they were trying to compete with their wealthier guests. The guest list represented a comprehensive survey of regional influence and inherited privilege. I recognized faces from newspaper society columns and business magazines, people whose family names were attached to hospital wings, university buildings, and charitable foundations throughout Connecticut and Massachusetts. These weren't just wealthy individuals. They were members of interconnected families whose social and business relationships had been cultivated across multiple generations. Judge Patricia Thornton held court near the windows overlooking the club's golf course, discussing recent legal precedents with a group of attorneys whose practices catered to the needs of established families. Her presence lent an air of judicial authority to the gathering, while her obvious comfort in the social setting reinforced the connections between legal, business, and social power that characterized the region's elite circles. Senator William Ashford circulated through the crowd with the practiced charm of a career politician, though his conversation seemed more focused on business relationships than campaign concerns. His wife Eleanor, who chaired the boards of 3 major cultural institutions, was engaged in animated discussion about upcoming museum exhibitions and symphony season programming, with other women whose philanthropic activities shaped the region's cultural landscape. The younger generation of guests represented the next wave of inherited influence and strategic marriage alliances. Harvard MBA graduates who had assumed leadership roles in family businesses, trust fund beneficiaries who were transforming inherited wealth into contemporary investment opportunities, and accomplished professionals who had married into established families were all present to witness and validate Marcus and Veronica's continued social ascension. I found myself relegated to the periphery of conversations, close enough to overhear discussions, but clearly not expected to contribute meaningfully, to exchanges about topics that required insider knowledge of business deals, political developments, and social dynamics. The conversational topics ranged from upcoming IPO opportunities to exclusive vacation destinations, from private school admissions strategies to art acquisition recommendations, subjects that assumed both substantial disposable income and extensive networks of privileged connections. Marcus's business associates from Wellington Capital Management formed a particularly imposing group near the bar. Their conversation focused on market analysis and investment strategies that involved sums of money I could barely comprehend. They spoke casually about billion-dollar transactions and international economic trends, their expertise evident in the technical precision of their analysis and the casual confidence with which they predicted market movements that would affect millions of people's financial futures. The women's conversations were equally sophisticated, but focused on different expressions of cultivated taste and social responsibility. They discussed art collections being donated to museums, charitable fundraising strategies for causes that required 6-figure minimum donations, and travel experiences that involved private jets and exclusive resorts in locations most people would never have the opportunity to visit. Even the service staff reflected the evening's elevated standards. Servers moved through the crowd with silent efficiency, their uniforms and deportment suggesting they had been specially trained for events requiring discretion and sophistication. The bartenders prepared complex cocktails with ingredients that had been specially ordered for the occasion, while the waitstaff offered hors d'oeuvres that represented culinary artistry rather than mere appetizers. The physical staging of the evening reinforced the social hierarchies present among the guests. Marcus and Veronica occupied the central position in the room's layout, naturally drawing other guests into their orbit through the magnetism of their combined social and financial influence. My parents maintained their strategic position near the entrance, clearly pleased to be recognized as legitimate family representatives in such distinguished company. I found myself gravitating toward the edges of conversations and the periphery of group formations, close enough to witness the evening's social dynamics, but far enough removed to avoid awkward moments when my different circumstances might become apparent through casual questioning. The positioning felt natural rather than deliberate, an instinctive recognition of my place in the evening's social ecosystem. What I couldn't have anticipated was how quickly the evening's carefully orchestrated elegance would dissolve into chaos, or how the very people who seemed most secure in their positions of privilege and influence would soon find themselves confronting the fundamental instability of their entire social and financial foundation. The confrontation began during cocktail hour with the kind of seemingly innocent question that would normally pass unnoticed in polite conversation. I had been standing near the edge of a group discussing recent market volatility when Eleanor Ashford, the senator's wife and museum board chairwoman, turned her attention to me with the kind of gracious interest that wealthy women deploy when acknowledging less prominent guests at social gatherings. "You must be Veronica's sister," she said with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Eleanor Ashford. I serve on several boards with your parents. They speak of Veronica so proudly. What line of work are you in, dear?" The question landed with the weight of social expectation. Everyone within earshot, approximately 8 people including 2 investment bankers, a federal judge's wife, and Marcus's closest business partner, turned their attention toward me with the polite interest that preceded either inclusion in the conversation or diplomatic redirection to more suitable topics. "I work in security," I replied simply, hoping the brevity might discourage follow-up questions that could lead to more detailed discussions of my specific job responsibilities. "Oh, how fascinating," Eleanor continued, though her tone suggested confusion rather than genuine interest. "Corporate security? I imagine that field has become quite sophisticated with all the technological developments we keep hearing about." Before I could clarify the nature of my actual work, Marcus appeared at my shoulder with the timing of someone who had been monitoring conversations throughout the room. His presence immediately elevated the social stakes of our exchange, as other guests recognized his approach and adjusted their attention accordingly. "Sophie works in institutional security," Marcus interjected smoothly, using the diminutive version of my name that somehow made me sound younger and less serious. "She's been exploring various opportunities in the field. Haven't you, Sophie?" The subtle correction of my job description and the implication that I was exploring opportunities rather than settled in my career created an immediate misunderstanding that I felt compelled to address. "Actually, I work as head of security at Millfield Community College," I said, my voice carrying more edge than I had intended. "I've been in the position for 3 years, and I'm very satisfied with the work." The silence that followed my clarification lasted only seconds, but it felt substantial enough to shift the entire energy of our conversational circle. Eleanor's expression moved through several phases: surprise, confusion, and finally the kind of diplomatic concern that wealthy people display when confronted with information that doesn't fit their social expectations. "Community college," repeated Dr. Harrison Webb, Marcus's business partner, his tone carrying the subtle incredulity of someone trying to process unexpected information. "That's quite different from what I would have expected for someone in your family." The comment hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Dr. Webb hadn't intended obvious insult, but his surprise at discovering my working-class employment was evident to everyone present. His assumption that the Carmichael family would naturally produce only white-collar professionals revealed the casual class prejudices that shaped the social world my family was so eager to join. Marcus moved quickly to contain the social damage. "Sophie has always been interested in public service," he said with the kind of patronizing warmth that adults use when discussing children's career ambitions. "Though I keep telling her there are tremendous opportunities in corporate security where her skills would be much better compensated." His intervention made everything worse by confirming that my career was indeed problematic enough to require explanation and defense. The other guests exchanged glances that conveyed their collective understanding that they were witnessing a family awkwardness that required careful navigation. "Public service is admirable," Judge Thornton's wife chimed in with the kind of forced enthusiasm that signals obvious discomfort. though I imagine the compensation challenges must be significant. The conversation had now moved beyond simple career discussion into territory that explicitly addressed my economic limitations in front of people whose annual charitable donations probably exceeded my yearly salary. I felt heat rising in my cheeks as the social humiliation crystallized into something more pointed and personal. "The compensation is adequate for my needs," I replied, though my voice carried a defensive tone that undermined the confident message I was trying to convey. "I find the work meaningful and professionally satisfying." "Of course," Eleanor said quickly, clearly eager to move past the uncomfortable revelations about my circumstances. "Meaningful work is so important, though I'm sure your parents must worry about your long-term financial security." The comment struck like a physical blow. Eleanor had just acknowledged publicly that my career choices were concerning enough to warrant parental worry, effectively confirming that everyone present considered my professional situation problematic rather than respectable. Veronica materialized beside our group with the perfect timing of someone who had been monitoring potentially difficult conversations throughout the evening. Her approach carried the urgent energy of damage control, though she maintained her hostess smile as she inserted herself into our increasingly uncomfortable exchange. "I hope you're all getting acquainted with my little sister," she said with forced brightness, the phrase "little sister" infantilizing me in a way that suggested my opinions and choices should be understood as immature rather than legitimate. "Sophie has always been our family idealist. She's never been motivated by conventional measures of success." The explanation was devastating in its casual dismissal of my adult autonomy and professional judgment. Veronica had just characterized my career satisfaction as naive idealism rather than informed choice, implying that my contentment with meaningful work reflected immaturity rather than different values. "How refreshing," Dr. Webb said with the kind of condescending approval that adults offer when discussing children's unrealistic dreams. "Though I imagine reality will eventually require more practical considerations." The assumption that my current happiness was temporary and would inevitably give way to practical considerations felt like a judgment on my intelligence and life planning abilities. These people were discussing my future as if my own assessment of my circumstances was irrelevant to determining what choices I should make. Marcus stepped closer, his presence creating a physical barrier that seemed designed to contain rather than support me. "The security field has some interesting corporate applications," he said, addressing the group rather than me directly. "Sophie just needs guidance about how to position her experience for better opportunities." His comment completed my transformation from autonomous adult to charity case requiring intervention from more successful family members. The conversation had evolved from social introduction to public demonstration that I was the family member, whose choices required correction and whose future needed management by people with superior judgment. "I'm sure you'll figure out the right direction," Eleanor said with finality, her tone suggesting that our conversation had reached its natural conclusion. Family support makes such a difference during career transitions. The phrase, career transitions crystallized the group's collective assessment that my current situation was temporary rather than chosen, problematic rather than satisfactory. They had decided among themselves that I was in transition away from my current work rather than established in a career that met my professional and personal needs. As other guests began turning their attention to different topics and conversation, partners, I stood surrounded by people who had just collectively determined that my life choices were mistakes requiring correction. The humiliation was complete and public, witnessed by some of the most influential people in the region's business and social circles. What none of them could have anticipated was that within the hour, their confident assumptions about success, failure, and appropriate career choices would be revealed as catastrophically misguided, and that the family disappointment they had just finished patronizing would be the only one left standing when their carefully constructed world collapsed into criminal scandal and financial ruin. The moment that would define the evening and reshape every relationship in my family came during the formal dinner presentations When Veronica decided that a public anniversary toast would be the perfect opportunity to address what she clearly viewed as the elephant in the room, her disappointment of a sister who was dragging down the family's newly elevated social status. Dinner had been served with the precision expected at Blackstone Country Club events. Each course arrived perfectly timed, elegantly plated, and accompanied by wine pairings that Marcus explained with the casual expertise of someone whose cellar was worth more than most people's houses. The conversation had flowed smoothly between tables, touching on topics that reinforced the shared interests and values of people accustomed to significant wealth and social influence. I had managed to navigate the meal without further career-related interrogation, though I noticed the careful way other guests avoided directly engaging me in conversations that might venture into potentially awkward territory. The earlier cocktail hour discussion had clearly circulated through the room's social network, creating a general awareness that the Carmichael family included a problematic member whose circumstances required delicate handling. As dessert was being served, individual chocolate soufflés that had been specially prepared by the club's executive chef, Veronica rose from her seat at the head table with the confident grace of someone who had never questioned her right to command attention. The gentle tapping of her champagne flute against crystal brought immediate silence to the room as 40 guests turned their focus toward the evening's hostess. "I want to thank everyone for joining Marcus and me tonight to celebrate 5 wonderful years of marriage," she began, her voice carrying the warm authority of someone completely comfortable addressing groups of influential people. "Having all of you here, our dearest friends, our trusted advisors, our beloved family, makes this anniversary truly special." The opening was conventional and gracious, exactly what guests would expect from someone of Veronica's social training and natural poise. She looked radiant under the chandelier light, every inch the successful woman who had achieved everything our parents had dreamed of for their daughters. "As many of you know," Veronica continued, her tone shifting slightly toward something more personal and reflective, "success isn't just about individual achievement. It's about the families that support us, the values that guide us, and the choices that define who we become." Something in her emphasis on choices sent a chill of apprehension through me. The word carried weight that suggested she was moving beyond conventional anniversary sentiments toward more pointed observations about family dynamics and personal decisions. "Marcus and I have been incredibly blessed in our careers and our personal lives," she said, pausing to smile at her husband with obvious affection. "But we've also learned that success requires dedication, ambition, and sometimes making difficult decisions about what kind of life you want to build." The guests nodded approvingly, recognizing familiar themes about achievement and personal responsibility that resonated with their own experiences of building and maintaining wealth and social position. They had no idea that Veronica was constructing a philosophical framework that would soon be used to justify a devastating personal attack. "Family support has been essential to everything we've accomplished," Veronica continued, her gaze moving around the room to acknowledge my parents, various relatives, and close family friends. "Though I have to admit, family dynamics can be complicated." The slight pause before "complicated" created a moment of tension that made several guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. The word choice suggested that Veronica was about to share something more personal and potentially controversial than typical anniversary toast content. "Some family members understand the importance of building toward a secure future," she said, her voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining obvious truths to people who might not understand them immediately. "Others seem content with more modest aspirations." The phrase "modest aspirations" landed like a slap across my face. Veronica had just characterized my career satisfaction as insufficient ambition rather than different values, using her anniversary toast as a platform to publicly critique my life choices in front of 40 of the region's most influential people. "I love my sister Sophia dearly," Veronica continued, turning to look directly at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But I have to confess that watching her settle for minimum wage work when she has so much potential has been one of the more challenging aspects of our family dynamic over the past few years. The silence that followed was absolute and devastating. Veronica had just announced to a room full of business leaders, political figures, and social luminaries that I was earning minimum wage, information that was both humiliating and inaccurate, since my salary as head of security was substantially higher than minimum wage, though certainly modest by the standards of people present. But the factual error was less important than the public nature of the attack. Veronica had chosen her anniversary celebration as the venue for delivering a systematic criticism of my career choices, using the most formal and public setting possible to announce her disappointment in my life decisions. "I keep hoping," she continued, her voice carrying the kind of concerned affection that made her criticism sound like loving worry rather than deliberate cruelty, "that Sophie will eventually realize that she's capable of so much more than working security at a community college, that she'll find the motivation to pursue opportunities that match her education and potential." The characterization of my work as beneath my education level was devastating in its casual dismissal of 3 years of professional growth and achievement. Veronica had just announced to the room that I was both underemployed and unmotivated, someone whose career choices reflected personal failure rather than conscious decision-making. Marcus nodded along with obvious agreement, his expression conveying the kind of supportive concern that husbands display when their wives share family worries. His visible approval of Veronica's public criticism confirmed that they had discussed my situation privately and reached mutual conclusions about my need for intervention and guidance. "Family means accepting people where they are," Veronica concluded, raising her champagne flute with a smile that managed to be both loving and condescending simultaneously. "Even when they're not living up to their full potential. Here's to 5 more years of growth, achievement, and supporting each other through life's various challenges." The toast that followed was polite but subdued, as guests processed the unexpected inclusion of family criticism in what should have been a celebration of marital happiness. Several people avoided making eye contact with me, clearly uncomfortable with having witnessed such a public humiliation, but uncertain about how to respond appropriately. My parents applauded along with everyone else, their expressions revealing their own discomfort with Veronica's public approach to family concerns, but also their unwillingness to contradict her assessment of my career choices in front of such distinguished company. Their silence felt like a final betrayal, confirming that even they considered my humiliation less important than maintaining social harmony with the influential guests surrounding us. The moment crystallized everything I had suspected about my place in my family's hierarchy. I wasn't just the disappointing daughter. I was the family failure whose circumstances were so embarrassing that they warranted public address during formal celebrations. Veronica had used her anniversary toast to announce that my contentment with meaningful work was actually evidence of insufficient ambition and personal limitation. As guests began offering congratulations to Veronica and Marcus while carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of the personal criticism they had just witnessed, I sat in my chair feeling completely exposed and utterly alone. The evening had transformed from social discomfort into public humiliation, with my own sister serving as the primary architect of my degradation. What none of us knew was that in less than 6 hours, federal agents would be executing search warrants that would reveal Marcus's success as systematic criminal fraud, and that the family disappointment, who had just been publicly dismissed as underachieving, would be the only one left with an honest career and clean reputation when the truth finally came to light. The first sign that something was wrong came during the final course of dinner, when I noticed Marcus's phone buzzing insistently against the table despite his obvious attempts to ignore it. He had set the device to silent for the evening's formal celebration, but the persistent vibration was visible to anyone sitting nearby. After the 4th consecutive call in less than 10 minutes, Marcus excused himself briefly to check the screen, his confident expression flickering with something that might have been concern. When he returned to the table moments later, his demeanor had shifted in ways that were subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew him well. The easy confidence that had characterized his entire evening seemed slightly forced now, his smile requiring more effort than it had during the earlier festivities. He participated in ongoing conversations with his usual charm, but I noticed him checking his phone more frequently, his attention occasionally drifting from the discussions around him. Veronica, still glowing from the positive reception of her anniversary toast and the successful humiliation of her disappointing sister, initially seemed oblivious to her husband's growing distraction. She continued accepting congratulations from guests who praised her eloquent remarks about family support and personal achievement, clearly enjoying the validation her public criticism of me had received from their distinguished audience. But as the evening progressed toward coffee and after-dinner drinks, Marcus's anxiety became more apparent to those of us who were watching closely. He excused himself twice more to take calls in the club's private phone alcove, each conversation lasting longer than social protocol would typically permit during formal celebrations. When he returned from the second call, his face had acquired a pallor that even the ballroom's flattering lighting couldn't disguise. The change in Marcus's behavior was gradual enough that most guests remained unaware of any developing crisis. Conversations continued flowing around topics of mutual interest, upcoming charity galas, vacation planning, and business opportunities that would benefit from collaborative relationships. The evening maintained its atmosphere of sophisticated celebration, with most attendees focused on the social and professional networking opportunities that such gatherings provided. But I found myself watching Marcus with the kind of focused attention that came from my professional training in security work. Something about his body language and the pattern of interruptions suggested developing circumstances that required careful monitoring. The timing of the calls, during a formal evening when business communications would typically be delayed until the following day, indicated urgency that couldn't wait for more appropriate business hours. Dr. Harrison Webb, Marcus's closest business partner and longtime friend, was the first guest to notice the pattern of interruptions and register concern about their potential significance. During one of Marcus's absences, I observed Webb checking his own phone with the kind of careful attention that suggested he was looking for messages related to whatever crisis might be developing at Wellington Capital Management. When Webb's expression darkened after reading something on his screen, I knew that the evening was about to take a turn that none of the assembled guests could have anticipated. He rose quietly from his seat and moved toward the phone alcove where Marcus was engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly heated conversation, his voice too low to overhear but his gestures indicating significant agitation. The two men returned to the ballroom together, their conversation continuing in urgent whispers that created a bubble of tension around their movement through the otherwise festive crowd. Other guests began noticing their obvious distress, though most assumed they were dealing with some routine business crisis that could be resolved with appropriate attention after the evening's celebrations concluded. Veronica finally registered that something significant was affecting her husband's ability to maintain his role as gracious host. Her own conversations became more distracted as she watched Marcus and Webb exchange increasingly concerned glances and check their phones with growing frequency. The confident glow that had surrounded her throughout the evening began to dim as she recognized that their carefully orchestrated celebration was being disrupted by circumstances beyond their control. Judge Patricia Thornton approached our family's table during coffee service, her expression carrying the kind of professional gravity that suggested she possessed information relevant to the developing situation. As one of the region's most respected federal judges, her presence at the anniversary celebration had added significant prestige to the guest list, but her current demeanor suggested she was transitioning from social attendee to legal authority. "Marcus," she said quietly, her voice carrying enough authority to immediately command his attention, despite the ongoing conversations around our table. "I think we need to speak privately. There are some matters developing that require immediate discussion. Phrase "matters developing" created an immediate shift in the energy surrounding our table. Several nearby guests turned their attention toward Judge Thornton's serious expression and Marcus's increasingly pale complexion, recognizing that something more significant than business difficulties was unfolding in real time during their anniversary celebration. Veronica's hand moved instinctively toward her husband's arm, her hostess training warring with growing alarm about circumstances that clearly threatened to disrupt not just their evening, but potentially their entire, carefully constructed life. The grace and confidence that had characterized her behavior throughout the celebration began giving way to something approaching panic as she realized that their social triumph was being overshadowed by a crisis whose scope she couldn't yet comprehend. Marcus stood slowly, his movement careful and deliberate as if he was trying to maintain his composure through sheer force of will. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in the club's private office," he said to Judge Thornton, his voice steady despite the obvious strain he was experiencing. As they prepared to leave the ballroom for their private discussion, I noticed several other guests checking their phones with renewed attention, their expressions suggesting that news of whatever crisis was developing had begun circulating through the business and legal networks that connected most of the evening's attendees. The isolated urgency that had initially affected only Marcus and Dr. Webb was beginning to spread through the broader group of assembled guests. Senator William Ashford approached Dr. Webb with obvious concern, their conversation conducted in the kind of urgent whispers that indicated serious political or legal implications requiring immediate attention. Eleanor Ashford, who had initiated my own humiliation earlier in the evening, moved toward Veronica with the diplomatic skill of someone experienced in managing social crises that threatened to disrupt important gatherings. The atmosphere in the ballroom had begun shifting from celebratory to apprehensive, as more guests became aware that something significant was developing beyond the scope of routine business or social difficulties. Conversations became more subdued, and I noticed several people making discreet phone calls of their own, probably checking with business associates or legal advisors who might have information about whatever crisis was affecting the Wellington family's interests. Dr. Richard Carmichael, my father, approached me with an expression of confusion and growing concern. "Sophia, do you have any idea what's happening?" he asked quietly, apparently assuming that my professional background in security might give me insight into crisis management or legal emergencies. For the first time all evening, my family was turning to me for expertise and guidance rather than dismissing my professional knowledge as irrelevant to their elevated social circumstances. The irony wasn't lost on me that the family disappointment, who had just been publicly criticized for her modest career ambitions, was suddenly being consulted about her professional insights into crisis assessment and emergency response protocols. What none of us could have anticipated was that within the next hour, every assumption about success, security, and social standing that had shaped the evening's interactions would be completely overturned, and that the community college security guard they had all dismissed would be the only person in the room whose career and reputation would survive the coming revelations intact. The revelation that would destroy everything my family believed about success and failure came not through dramatic announcement or theatrical disclosure, but through the quiet authority of Judge Patricia Thornton's voice as she returned to the ballroom with Marcus trailing behind her, his face now completely drained of color and his previous confidence replaced by something approaching terror. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Thornton said, her voice cutting through the subdued conversations that had filled the ballroom during their 20-minute absence, "I'm afraid I need to address a situation that affects several people in this room. As a federal judge, I've just been contacted by the FBI regarding ongoing criminal investigations that require immediate attention." The silence that followed was complete and electric. 40 guests who had gathered to celebrate wealth and social achievement suddenly found themselves in the presence of federal criminal proceedings, their anniversary celebration transformed into the setting for what appeared to be significant legal developments. Marcus stood beside Judge Thornton with the posture of someone whose entire world had just collapsed. The confident businessman who had commanded attention throughout the evening now looked like a man facing circumstances completely beyond his control or comprehension. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the back of a chair, using it for physical support as well as psychological grounding. The FBI has been conducting a comprehensive investigation into securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering activities centered around Wellington Capital Management, Judge Thornton continued, her professional demeanor providing stark contrast to the personal devastation visible in Marcus's expression. Federal agents are currently executing search warrants at the firm's offices and at several private residences, including the Wellington family home. Veronica's champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stunned silence. Her carefully styled hair and designer gown suddenly looked like costumes from a performance that had ended abruptly, leaving her exposed and defenseless in front of an audience that was witnessing the complete destruction of everything she had built her identity around. The investigation alleges that Wellington Capital Management has been operating a sophisticated Ponzi scheme for the past 4 years, Judge Thornton explained, her words falling like hammer blows against the assembled guests who had trusted their investments and business relationships to the firm's management. Client funds totaling approximately $800 million have been misappropriated, with new investor money being used to pay returns to existing clients, while actual investments were diverted to personal accounts and luxury expenditures. Dr. Harrison Webb, who had been Marcus's closest business partner and co-conspirator, made a sound that was part gasp and part sob as the full scope of their criminal exposure became clear. Several other guests immediately began checking their phones, probably calculating their own potential losses or attempting to contact attorneys who could help them navigate the legal and financial chaos that was about to engulf anyone connected to Wellington Capital Management. Marcus Wellington III has been named as the primary defendant in a federal indictment that includes 47 counts of securities fraud, 23 counts of wire fraud, and 16 counts of money laundering. Judge Thornton continued with the methodical precision of someone delivering a legal judgment. Dr. Harrison Webb and 3 other senior executives have also been indicted on related charges. The information was processing through the room in waves of shock and disbelief. These weren't abstract criminals being discussed in news reports. These were people they knew personally, business partners they had trusted with their investments, social connections they had cultivated for professional advantage. The revelation that Marcus's success had been built on systematic theft from clients was reframing every interaction they had ever had with the Wellington family. Senator William Ashford stood slowly, his political instincts clearly calculating the damage that his association with criminal defendants might cause to his career and reputation. Judge Thornton, he said carefully, what are the immediate implications for people who may have had business or investment relationships with the firm? The FBI will be contacting all clients and business associates as part of their investigation, she replied. Anyone who invested money with Wellington Capital Management should expect to lose most or all of their principal, as the firm's assets appear to be insufficient to cover even a fraction of their client obligations. The financial implications hit the room like a physical force. Many of the evening's guests had invested substantial portions of their wealth with Marcus's firm, attracted by the consistently high returns and exclusive access that came with personal relationships to the Wellington family. They were now facing not just embarrassment about their association with criminals, but potentially devastating financial losses that could destroy their own accumulated wealth. Veronica finally found her voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper that barely carried across the silent ballroom. "This has to be a mistake," she said, looking desperately around the room for support or contradiction from people who had previously competed for her attention and approval. "Marcus would never, Mrs. Wellington," Judge Thornton said with professional gentleness. Federal agents discovered extensive documentation of the fraud during today's searches. Bank records, email communications, and financial statements provide overwhelming evidence of systematic criminal activity spanning multiple years. The judge's words shattered Veronica's last hope for plausible denial or alternative explanations. Her husband wasn't just facing accusations. He was confronting documented evidence of years of deliberate criminal behavior that had funded their entire lifestyle, from their mansion in Millfield Heights to the designer gowns and luxury vehicles that had symbolized their social success. My parents sat frozen at their table, watching their carefully constructed social advancement crumble in real time, as their connection to the Wellington family transformed from prestigious association to criminal liability. The son-in-law they had celebrated as their daughter's greatest achievement was now a federal defendant whose crimes had potentially destroyed the financial security of everyone who had trusted his professional expertise. The irony was staggering and complete. For 3 years, my family had criticized my career choices as insufficiently ambitious and financially limiting. They had portrayed my satisfaction with honest work as failure to reach my potential, while celebrating Marcus's financial success as evidence of superior judgment and business acumen. Now, surrounded by the wreckage of their social and financial world, they were discovering that the family disappointment working security at a community college had been the only one with a legitimate career and clean reputation. While they had been building their status on criminal proceeds, I had been earning honest wages through meaningful work that served my community. Dr. Webb attempted one final act of damage control, his voice shaking as he addressed Judge Thornton. Your Honor, many of us had no knowledge of any irregular activities. We trusted Marcus's expertise and had no reason to suspect. The investigation will determine levels of knowledge and participation, Judge Thornton replied firmly. However, I should mention that federal agents will be questioning all senior executives, board members, and significant clients as part of their efforts to recover stolen funds and identify additional defendants. The threat of expanded criminal charges sent another wave of panic through the assembled guests. People who had arrived expecting to celebrate success and network for future opportunities were now facing potential federal investigation as accessories to securities fraud or money laundering. As federal agents began entering the ballroom to begin preliminary interviews with potential witnesses and co-conspirators, I sat in my modest dress from the consignment shop, watching the complete destruction of everything my family had valued and pursued. The worthless daughter who had been publicly humiliated for her insufficient ambition was now the only family member whose career choices would survive federal criminal investigation. The evening that had begun with my sister's public criticism of my modest aspirations was ending with her husband in federal custody and their entire social circle facing financial ruin and potential criminal prosecution. The community college security guard they had all dismissed as underachieving was about to become the most financially stable and legally secure person in the room. 6 months after that devastating anniversary dinner, I sat in the very same conference room at Blackstone Country Club, now serving as the regional headquarters for the Federal Victim Assistance Program, helping Wellington Capital Management fraud victims recover what remained of their savings. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same ballroom where my sister had publicly humiliated me for my modest aspirations was now the place where I coordinated support services for the hundreds of people whose trust in Marcus's financial expertise had cost them their life savings. The federal investigation had moved with surprising speed once the evidence of systematic fraud became undeniable. Marcus had ultimately pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence of 15 years in federal prison, though the judge made it clear that his cooperation in helping investigators trace stolen funds was the only reason he wasn't facing life imprisonment. Dr. Harrison Webb and 2 other senior executives received similar sentences, while several junior employees accepted plea bargains in exchange for testifying about the firm's criminal operations. Veronica's world had collapsed with brutal completeness. The mansion in Millfield Heights had been seized by federal marshals as part of asset recovery efforts, along with her jewelry collection, designer wardrobe, and luxury vehicles, all purchased with stolen client money. She had moved back in with our parents, occupying her childhood bedroom while attempting to find employment that would provide basic financial survival rather than social advancement. The job search had been particularly humbling for someone whose previous career success had been built entirely on connections and family status rather than transferable skills. Marketing firms were reluctant to hire someone whose husband's criminal conviction had generated negative publicity that could affect their other client relationships. Her Harvard MBA carried less weight when potential employers considered the liability of associating their brands with the Wellington family scandal. During our first conversation since the anniversary dinner, a difficult meeting I had initiated, 3 months after Marcus's sentencing, Veronica had apologized with genuine remorse for her public criticism of my career choices. "I was so wrong about everything," she had said, tears flowing down cheeks that no longer bore the careful makeup application that had once been part of her daily routine. "You were the only one of us who was actually building something real." The apology had felt both meaningful and insufficient. Years of systematic dismissal and condescension couldn't be erased by a single conversation, regardless of how sincere her regret might be. But I could see that her circumstances had forced her to confront fundamental assumptions about worth, success, and the difference between achievement and performance that she had never previously questioned. My parents' adjustment to their new reality had been equally challenging, but perhaps more genuine in its self-reflection. Dad had lost approximately 40% of his retirement savings through investments with Wellington Capital Management, forcing him to reconsider his plans for reducing his surgical practice and enjoying the comfortable retirement they had anticipated. More importantly, he had been forced to acknowledge that his prioritization of social advancement over family loyalty had been both morally wrong and strategically catastrophic. "I should have defended you," he had told me during one of our weekly dinners at a modest restaurant we could both afford, a significant change from the expensive establishments where we had previously gathered for family celebrations. "I was so impressed by Marcus's success that I forgot to value the success you had actually earned through honest work." Mom's transformation had been the most dramatic of all. The woman who had spent years coaching me toward more socially acceptable career choices was now working part-time at a local nonprofit organization, having discovered that meaningful work provided satisfaction that social status had never delivered. Her volunteer coordination role paid barely above minimum wage, but she spoke about it with enthusiasm that her previous community leadership positions had never generated. "I understand now why you found your security work fulfilling," she had said during one of our conversations about her new job helping coordinate services for elderly residents. "When your work actually helps people, instead of just impressing them, it feels completely different." The broader community's response to the Wellington scandal had been swift and unforgiving. Families who had lost their children's college funds or their retirement security to Marcus's fraud had no sympathy for anyone associated with the criminal enterprise. The social circles that had once competed for Veronica's attention now treated the entire Carmichael family as reminders of their own poor judgment in trusting appearances over substance. My own professional life had taken unexpected turns that reflected both the skills I had developed in security work and the insights gained from witnessing white-collar crime from the inside. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had recruited me as a consultant on financial fraud cases, recognizing that my combination of security expertise and personal knowledge of how affluent criminals operated made me valuable for investigating similar schemes. The consulting work paid substantially, more than my college security position, while allowing me to continue the meaningful public service that had always motivated my career choices. More importantly, it had connected me with other professionals who valued authenticity and competence over social connections and inherited privilege. Mrs. Chen, my elderly landlord and informal mentor, had followed the news coverage of the Wellington scandal with the satisfaction of someone whose wisdom had been vindicated by events. People who measure worth by money instead of character always discover that money disappears faster than character develops. She had observed with the practical philosophy that had guided her successful immigration and business ownership. had used part of my increased FBI consulting income to help Mrs. Chen expand her flower shop into a small community center, offering English language classes and business development workshops for other immigrant entrepreneurs. The project had grown into something that served the authentic community building values that had always been more important to me than individual advancement. The most satisfying aspect of my transformed circumstances wasn't the financial improvement or professional recognition, though both were welcome. It was the realization that my instincts about meaningful work and authentic relationships had been correct all along, despite years of family pressure to abandon them for more socially impressive alternatives. The anniversary dinner that had been designed to showcase my inadequacy had instead revealed the inadequacy of everyone who had judged me. The family disappointment, who had been criticized for insufficient ambition, had been the only one with sufficient integrity to build a life that could survive scrutiny from federal investigators. Eleanor Ashford, who had initiated my career interrogation that evening, had lost her husband's Senate seat when his association with Wellington Capital Management became a campaign liability. Judge Thornton, who had delivered the devastating news about Marcus's criminal charges, had commended my assistance with victim services and recommended me for additional federal consulting opportunities. The country club itself had been forced to implement new membership screening procedures after the scandal revealed how many of their most prestigious members had been involved in or victimized by financial crimes. The institution that had once represented the pinnacle of social achievement had become a symbol of how easily wealth could disguise criminal behavior and how quickly status could disappear when built on fraudulent foundations. As I packed up my files from another day of helping fraud victims navigate their financial recovery, I reflected on how completely the evening's power dynamics had been reversed. The ballroom where I had been publicly humiliated for my working-class career now housed the program I directed to help victims of white-collar crime. The family that had dismissed my professional judgment now sought my advice about rebuilding their lives with honest work and authentic relationships. The greatest lesson hadn't been about vindication or revenge, though both had certainly occurred. It had been about the difference between success that's performed for others and success that's built through serving others. The community college security guard they had all pitied had been developing exactly the skills and values that proved most valuable when everything else collapsed. Standing in the parking lot where my Honda had once looked so modest among the luxury vehicles, I drove home to my expanded apartment above Mrs. Chen's flower shop, knowing that I had built something real that would last because it was based on truth rather than appearance, service rather than status, and character rather than connections. The family disappointment had become the family foundation, not through dramatic transformation, but through the simple persistence of choosing authenticity over performance, even when that choice had seemed to cost everything I thought I wanted to achieve. 5 years after that anniversary dinner that changed everything, I stood at the podium of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia, addressing a room filled with FBI agents, financial investigators, and white-collar crime specialists from across the country. The presentation I was delivering, Recognizing Social Engineering in Elite Financial Fraud, Lessons from the Wellington Capital Case, had become one of the most requested training programs in federal law enforcement. The irony wasn't lost on me that the family disappointment, who had once been criticized for her insufficient education, was now teaching advanced investigative techniques to agents with Ivy League degrees and decades of experience. My expertise hadn't come from prestigious universities or family connections. It had come from witnessing firsthand how financial criminals used social status and community respectability to disguise systematic theft. The Wellington case demonstrates how fraud perpetrators leverage social hierarchies to silence potential whistleblowers, I explained to the attentive audience. Victims become complicit in maintaining the fraud because exposing it would damage their own social standing and professional relationships. In the front row, Special Agent Maria Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. She had been the lead investigator on the Wellington case and had recommended me for this training position after witnessing how my insights into elite social dynamics had helped crack several related fraud schemes. Ms. Carmichael's perspective on how these criminals weaponize social pressure has revolutionized how we approach white-collar investigations, she had written in her recommendation letter. After my presentation, I drove through the Georgia countryside toward Savannah, where I was scheduled to meet with another group of fraud victims who were struggling to rebuild their lives after losing everything to a Ponzi scheme similar to Marcus's operation. The work was emotionally demanding, but deeply satisfying in ways that my family's previous definition of success never could have provided. My phone buzzed with a text message from Veronica. Saw the article about your FBI training program in the Washington Post. So proud of you. Coffee next week when you're back in Connecticut? The relationship with my sister had required careful rebuilding over the past 5 years. Her genuine remorse about her past behavior had been evident, but trust needed to be earned through consistent actions rather than apologetic words. She had eventually found work as a program coordinator for a financial literacy nonprofit, earning a modest salary while helping other people avoid the investment mistakes that had destroyed so many lives. Financial education is the most important work I've ever done, she had told me during our last conversation. I spent years thinking success meant impressing people with expensive things. Now I know success means helping people protect themselves from the kind of fraud that destroyed our family. Her transformation seemed genuine, though I remained cautious about fully trusting someone who had demonstrated such complete disregard for my worth when it served her social interests. Time would continue to reveal whether her changed perspective reflected genuine growth or merely adaptation to reduced circumstances. Dad had retired from surgery the previous year, partly due to age, but mainly because his reduced financial resources had eliminated the pressure to maintain an expensive lifestyle. He had surprised everyone by volunteering as a medical coordinator for a free clinic in Hartford. Discovering late in life that treating patients who genuinely needed his skills was more fulfilling than performing elective procedures for wealthy clients who could afford multiple alternatives. I should have learned from you years ago that work means more when it serves people who actually need your help, he had admitted during one of our monthly dinners. All those years I spent building a practice to impress other doctors, when the most meaningful medicine happens in places like this clinic. Mom had been promoted to director of volunteer services at her nonprofit organization, overseeing programs that helped elderly residents navigate Social Security benefits, Medicare, enrollment, and housing assistance. Her enthusiasm for work that directly improved people's lives had been a revelation to family members who remembered her previous obsession with country club committees and charity galas that functioned more as social networking than genuine service. The most unexpected development had been my romantic relationship with Detective James Sullivan, a financial crimes investigator with the Connecticut State Police who had worked on the Wellington case aftermath. We had connected over our shared commitment to protecting vulnerable people from sophisticated criminals, and our relationship had grown steadily over 3 years of working on similar cases. James understood my professional passion in ways that someone from my family's previous social circle never could have. He respected my expertise, valued my insights, and supported my career advancement without any need to manage or redirect my choices toward more socially acceptable alternatives. Most importantly, he had demonstrated consistent character under pressure, never wavering in his commitment to justice, regardless of political or social pressure from influential defendants. You realize your FBI consulting income now exceeds what Marcus was making at Wellington Capital during his legitimate years, James had observed during a recent conversation about our future plans, though I suspect you measure success differently than he did. The comment had prompted reflection about how completely my circumstances had changed since that anniversary dinner 5 years ago. The woman who had been publicly humiliated for earning minimum wage now commanded consulting fees that placed her in the top 5% of income earners. But more importantly, the work itself provided the kind of professional satisfaction that money alone could never deliver. Mrs. Chen, now in her late 70s, continued operating her flower shop while serving as an informal advisor for the immigrant entrepreneur program we had developed together. Her wisdom about measuring success through service rather than status had proven prophetic in ways neither of us could have anticipated during our evening tea conversations in her small apartment. "You always understood what your family took years to learn," she had told me recently. "Character builds slowly but lasts forever. Money and status disappear quickly, but character survives every crisis." The community center we had created above her flower shop now served over 200 immigrant families annually, providing English classes, business development workshops, and financial literacy training designed to help people avoid the kind of investment fraud that had devastated so many Wellington Capital victims. The program had been recognized by the state government as a model for immigrant integration and economic development. As I drove toward my next fraud victim assistance meeting, I reflected on how the evening that was supposed to demonstrate my inadequacy had instead revealed the inadequacy of everyone who had judged me. The family that had dismissed my career choices as insufficiently ambitious had learned through devastating experience that authentic work provides security that criminal success can never deliver. The anniversary dinner where my sister had publicly criticized my modest aspirations had become the night when everything they valued was exposed as built on stolen money, while everything they had dismissed as worthless proved to be the foundation for meaningful achievement and lasting security. 5 years later, the family disappointment had become a nationally recognized expert whose insights were shaping federal law enforcement training, whose income exceeded any legitimate success Marcus had ever achieved, and whose work was protecting thousands of people from the kind of financial predators who had once been welcomed into the most exclusive social circles. But the greatest vindication wasn't professional recognition or financial success. It was the knowledge that I had always been right about what mattered most. Honest work, authentic relationships, and service to others had provided the foundation for a life that could survive any scrutiny and weather any crisis. The community college security guard they had all pitied was now teaching FBI agents how to catch criminals like the ones her own family had once celebrated as the pinnacle of success and achievement. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.